All right, so I'm going to kick us off as we go forward. Is that right? All right, great. Well, so thank you all so much for that really wonderful introduction. My name is Renee Williams, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from the National Housing Law Project. And we're really excited to be here today to talk about a really important issue where, that folks may not be as familiar with, and we think is a really great opportunity for folks who advocate for the needs of survivors, and particularly the housing needs of survivors. Karlo and I have been working on this and really trying to get the word out to make sure that these emergency housing vouchers, are able to serve survivors and serve the folks that the vouchers are intended to serve. Because as we'll talk about, some of the requirements and qualification criteria are a little bit different in terms of eligibility and with respect to making these vouchers more low barrier than maybe you've seen if you're familiar with the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about, we'll talk about here how these programs are the same and how they're different. So could we go to the next slide, please? One back, if you don't mind. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Sorry. All right. So we're talking about emergency housing vouchers. What are we talking about here? And, if folks are familiar with the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, Section 8 vouchers, where the subsidy moves with the survivor or the tenant more generally, because vouchers are not just specific to survivors, but a lot of survivors have vouchers. Some of this is going to sound really familiar, and then Karlo and I are also going to talk about where there are distinctions and perhaps good opportunities for advocacy with your local housing authority, with the local COC, et cetera. So we'll get into all of that. But first, what is it that we're talking about? So we're talking about emergency housing vouchers, which is a product of the American Rescue Plan. So $5 billion was allocated for these emergency housing vouchers. And the math sort of works out to around 70,000 of vouchers, which is, a good number, and, not nearly enough to meet the need, but still, a really important development here, particularly with some of the things that HUD is trying to do with these particular vouchers, again, to make them more low barrier. So like the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, if for those of you who are familiar, and if you're not, basically the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, you go to your local housing authority, a tenant who wants to be in the voucher program applies generally through the local housing authority. A lot of times they're on a wait list, oftentimes for very long periods of time. There are just not enough vouchers to meet the need, right? And with Section 8 vouchers, the difference is between this and maybe other types of subsidized housing, like public housing or the low-income housing tax credit program, is that once somebody, waits on the wait list and is finally able to get a voucher, they use that voucher to lease up on the private market. And, there are all sorts of program requirements and all those sorts of things in terms of how to determine how much rent subsidy a particular household gets. But that's the general idea, that you're able to take this voucher and lease up on the private rental market, which gives the tenant a lot of flexibility particularly for survivors, it allows them to be able to move somewhere to a neighborhood that feels safe for them, but also serves the needs of, maybe their children or, closer to social supports like other family, et cetera. And so in that sense, these vouchers are very similar. They're going to allow someone to take the voucher and then move and relocate on the private market. So that is, in a way, how they're similar. They're also both administered locally by what are called PHAs, the public housing agencies. And, again, really the defining characteristic of vouchers, both emergency housing vouchers, as well as housing choice vouchers, is that they're mobile. They move with the tenant. And that's a really important piece. And again, it really gives the holder of a voucher flexibility in terms of leasing up somewhere where they feel safe. Now, of course, in reality, for folks who work with voucher holders, that leasing up is survivors as well as others face a lot of challenges in terms of being able to effectively use their voucher. But this idea of being mobile and having a subsidy that you can use on the private market is sort of the hallmark feature of both the regular sort of mainstream housing choice voucher program and then the specific program, the emergency housing voucher. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about emergency housing vouchers, we're not talking about every single housing authority. HUD basically used a formula to determine which PHAs actually are being allocated emergency housing vouchers. And, the PHAs actually didn't have to accept the vouchers. My understanding, and Karlo, feel free to jump in if I'm wrong, is that most housing authorities did accept their allocation. And so if you go to this website, and for those of you who are engaging in work around emergency housing vouchers, this is probably your first stop in terms of getting the most up-to-date information from HUD, because HUD is continuously updating this website, trying to add more and more information. And this is the place where the sort of centralized portal for information that you can get about the program from HUD directly. And then, as we move on through the presentation, we're also going to share some specific resources for survivors. Yeah. Thanks, Karlo. Thanks for confirming that. That was my understanding as well. Great, next slide. So what Karlo did was she actually, because we knew that we were presenting to you all in North Carolina, is just provide a snapshot of the housing authorities in North Carolina that we're talking about. And so you'll see on this, and as was mentioned earlier, the slides are going to be shared with everyone, but just take a quick look, see if your housing authority, that you work with is on there, and also just take a look at the number, right? Raleigh actually has a fair number of vouchers coming in, whereas some of the other housing authorities might be a little bit of a smaller allocation. And again, this was determined by a formula that HUD, created and then used to allocate these vouchers. Next slide, please. So who qualifies for these emergency housing vouchers? So one, and again, a running theme of this presentation is just really highlighting the similarities and differences between this program and sort of what we call the mainstream or housing choice voucher program, basically the Section 8 voucher program that you may already be familiar with. So what makes emergency housing vouchers special is that they are targeted for specific populations. And this is why we want, Karlo and I are trying to get the word out to survivor advocates, because one of the categories, as you see, and we've included as the first category, are that EHVs. One of the categories is individuals and families who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, stalking, or human trafficking. And these definitions, for those of you who may be familiar with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA, might note that human trafficking is added here. A lot of times when we've been talking about housing protections for survivors, we're oftentimes talking about the Violence Against Women Act. We're talking about VAWA and VAWA 2013, which has domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking as sort of the categories of violence that are covered by VAWA. And then EHVs have also added survivors of human trafficking. So that category of eligibility is really important. And that's, again, why we want to talk to as many survivor advocates as we can to make sure that folks understand that, survivors are one of the 4 eligible categories for EHVs. The other categories deal with people who are experiencing homelessness or are otherwise housing vulnerable or insecure. So for example, at risk of experiencing homelessness, or who are recently homeless, and obtaining this voucher would again prevent the person from going back to experiencing homelessness. So you essentially have 3 categories that specifically address people experiencing homelessness or are sort of housing insecure. And then you also have a specific category related to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, etc. And again, these definitions are taken from these particular statutes like VAWA and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I would also just note that, particularly for VAWA, and for the TVPA as well, those definitions, can include a lot of conduct, a lot of different situations. So definitely take a look at how these statutes define these types of crimes and offenses. And when I say crimes, I just want to make clear, there's been a little bit of confusion in the field, and understandably so, with how, these terms are defined. Like, for example, domestic violence is defined in VAWA as, in terms of crimes of violence. And, just wanted to take a second here and just remind folks that there does not have to be any sort of criminal legal system involvement, no sorts of calls to police or getting a restraining order or a police report. None of that is actually required to establish that somebody is a survivor. And again, because of the way that these terms are defined and they use terms like crimes, just again, want to make clear that in order to prove that somebody is a survivor, we're not talking about, oh, you have to produce a police report, or you have to produce, in another webinar, somebody asked, does there have to be a forensic examination or anything like that? And no, and we'll get a little bit more into documentation, but I just wanted to make that point, just given the reliance on these definitions. Next slide, please. So other eligibility requirements. So there are income qualifications. And really, what we're talking about is people who are very low income, right? Like we're talking about folks who, again, are housing insecure, right? So there are certain income requirements. But what I want to focus on for the purposes of the next couple of slides include a couple of places where survivors oftentimes run into issues with being able to obtain housing and even, get admitted to the regular mainstream voucher program. So the emergency housing vouchers only have 2 criminal history related, what are called mandatory exclusions from the program. Now, of course, that, if the household meets the other eligibility requirements, and in a couple of slides, we'll go through, things that are not allowed to prohibit somebody from obtaining housing. But these are the 2 that a housing authority is required to say, sorry, you're not eligible due to criminal history. So the first is a conviction of manufacturing or producing methamphetamine in federally assisted housing. Note it says conviction, right? Not arrests, it's conviction. And so that's an important point, as well as subject to lifetime registration requirement under a state sex offender registration program. Again, it's a lifetime registration requirement. So, these are fairly narrow mandatory prohibitions related to criminal history. A lot of times, particularly in situations of domestic violence or human trafficking, because of the coercive nature of those types of violence, survivors, unfortunately, also have criminal histories because, a lot of times stemming directly from the abuse and the violence and the coercion that goes with that, as you all know. And so not having sort of wide-ranging mandatory prohibitions related to criminal history is intended to make these emergency housing vouchers much lower barrier. It also provides a really good opportunity for advocacy with your housing authority, because what this means in terms of, only having 2 mandatory prohibitions is that there are things that a housing authority is allowed to consider. And again, we'll break it down in a couple slides, but it provides a lot of opportunity for advocates to address, how the housing authority is using its discretion. What policies does it have in place that, the housing authority is actually setting those requirements that's not actually being required by statute, and in what ways is that actually hindering survivors from being able to obtain safe, stable and affordable housing. Next slide, we're also going to talk about immigration requirements. So the immigration requirements, so these, for those of you who are familiar with the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, the immigration requirements are going to be the same as those in the voucher program. So what that means is at least one household member must be a US citizen, national, or otherwise a quote unquote eligible immigrant. And on the next slide, I believe, but not yet in terms of moving over, but we'll talk about what eligible immigrant means. But importantly, what that means is, the US citizen or otherwise eligible immigrant can be a minor child as part of the household. So the idea is if you have a child who's a minor, who's a US citizen, but you have a parent who is not an eligible immigrant, what happens is the assistance, the housing subsidy, is prorated to basically provide a subsidy for those who have eligible immigration status, not subsidize the folks who lack eligible immigration status, but the household can still live together. This was a policy that, was where the prior administration sought to roll this back, but just to be clear, this idea of households with mixed immigration statuses, that policy has not changed, such that folks who have mixed immigration statuses can live in a household together with a voucher, with the assistance being prorated to provide a subsidy only to those with eligible immigration status. Next slide, please.
Renee, can I stop you for a moment?
Yes, please, go ahead.
There's a question in the chat box that I wanted to just highlight. So it has to do with folks who have trouble leasing up because of having a history of evictions or owing landlord money or criminal histories. So many landlords will not accept individuals into housing when there's a history of evictions or owing landlord money or criminal histories. So the voucher may not disqualify people based on this, but we still need to find housing options that will accept people to live there. Can you talk a little bit more about how folks with those kinds of histories would be able to lease up with a voucher?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And, I think the issue with leasing up is it's a long-term issue. There are some things that this program, the Emergency Housing Voucher Program, has in terms of additional support that can be used to essentially incentivize landlords, and we'll talk about that I think in a few slides, where we'll talk about the EHVs, these emergency housing vouchers, come with some additional funds that, per the housing authority's discretion, can be used to provide landlord incentives, to provide housing search assistance. So the housing search assistance piece is actually a requirement. And one thing that victim service providers can do is to see if they are able to be involved with the housing search assistance process, such that somebody has an EHV, and can the housing authority use some of those funds to work with victim service providers to then sort of facilitate that relationship with landlords that may already have pre-existing relationships with victim service providers. So one thing might be looking at those services fees. They're $3,500 per voucher, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. The other thing is just remembering that, particularly for the low-income housing tax credit program, for example, can't discriminate on the basis of source of income. So that might, provide a little bit more grounding to help voucher holders lease up. But unfortunately, there's not a great answer to this, in terms of convincing housing providers to accept voucher holders who have some of these negative rental histories. There, is possibly arguments that can be made under, statutes like the Violence Against Women Act or the Fair Housing Act, where you're alleging that, those specific circumstances are stemming from the abuse or violence, and so not renting to a voucher holder on those bases can constitute housing discrimination. So there are potential avenues for advocacy, but that point is very well taken, that in a lot of ways, survivors still have a lot to contend with, even when they're able to get their hands on one of these vouchers or a regular housing choice voucher. I don't know, Karlo, did you have anything to add to that? Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I think, if folks are interested or are seeing this, in your community where you have housing providers who may not want to rent to survivors for, a lot of the reasons that Alyssa spoke to. And those particular circumstances are directly related to the abuse or violence. Please reach out to National Housing Law Project. We'd love to talk more in depth about that, and kind of see if we can work together on particular advocacy strategies. So, but that point is immensely well taken. All right. Yes. So, and there is a question in the chat. I'll just reiterate really quickly. Mixed immigration status family. Yes. As Karlo responded, just want to reiterate that mixed status families can include a voucher being issued to a household based on the immigration status of the child or children, even if they're under 18. So, just again, wanted to reiterate that, and thanks for the question, and thanks to Karlo for monitoring the chat. Okay, so who are eligible immigrants? So we're going to continue, just this discussion about immigration status. So, this list is, meant to be a fairly, is an exhaustive list in terms of who qualifies as eligible immigrants, obviously US citizens, as well as LPRs, lawful permanent residents. One thing that I wanted to note is VAWA self-petitioners, because this is based on guidance that HUD put out in 2016. And so there might still be housing authorities who don't understand that VAWA self-petitioners, basically survivors who have started the process of trying to become a VAWA self-petitioner and trying to obtain immigration status independently of an abusive spouse, for example. During the pendency of that process, that individual is eligible for an emergency housing voucher. And then there are other, very specific immigration categories, that are listed here. But I specifically wanted to speak to the VAWA self-petitioner issue as well. And if folks have particular questions about any of these categories, please put them in the chat or hold questions till the end, or however you want to do it. But yeah, thank you, Karlo, and Karlo, just for folks who might not be monitoring the chat, Karlo just pasted in the VAWA self-petitioner memo that can be helpful and handy for advocacy with housing authorities. If you have a VAWA self-petitioner, if you're working with a self-petitioner who is being denied housing assistance on that basis. Next slide, please. So what is different about EHVs? So one thing that's different, so I mentioned at the beginning that really when you're talking about Section 8 vouchers, you're talking about housing authorities who are administering the voucher program, and that includes determining eligibility. What's different about the emergency housing vouchers is that housing authorities are required to work with the local continuums of care, as well as with homelessness and victim service provider organizations as referral partners. So the way that the EHVs are to be structured is that, remember we talked about the 4 categories. So the COC, and other referral partners are going to be the folks who are really determining whether somebody falls within one of those 4 categories in order to be eligible for an emergency housing voucher. So if a survivor, who isn't already being served by a housing authority, is interested in obtaining an emergency housing voucher, they need to go to the COC, or depending on, what the local circumstances are, if victim service provider organizations are also referral partners. But the idea is that the COC is making that determination of who is a survivor of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking, as well as those other categories that relate to people experiencing homelessness. HUD is requiring that these relationships be memorialized in memoranda of understanding. So the COCs are involved, and this is what we expect to be the majority of interactions, but we'd love to hear how you're seeing this play out in your local communities, if your PHA and COCs are further along. So we expect that in most cases that the survivor goes to the COC, and then the COC determines eligibility and sends the survivor to the housing authority to get a voucher. The other use for emergency housing vouchers is if you're working with a survivor who is already being served by the housing authority. Say you have a survivor client who lives in public housing, and they need an emergency transfer, meaning, they need to be able to relocate quickly for safety, or if they're a survivor of sexual assault, that, they experience a sexual assault within the prior 90 days on the premises. In those situations, survivors, under the Violence Against Women Act, are entitled to apply for an emergency transfer to allow them to move to safety and to a unit that they consider to be safe. So just wanted to flag that is another important use for emergency housing vouchers. If you're working with a survivor who's already being served by the local housing authority, and the local housing authority has an emergency housing voucher allocation. In reality, a lot of housing authorities don't have a truly functioning emergency transfer plan, but the idea is that these EHVs can be used to fulfill requests for emergency transfers from existing PHA residents. Okay, I'm gonna continue. Next slide, please. So I mentioned, one of the defining characteristics of the EHV program is the emphasis on trying to be as low barrier as possible. And that also includes documentation of the violence. And so, as I mentioned, housing authorities are in most cases going to be relying on the continuums of care or the victim service provider or other referral partners to be making this determination. And as you can see here, HUD has created, and it's on that website that I pointed out earlier, hud.gov/EHV. HUD has created a template or sample form for survivors. So basically what this form would be used for is that, say, for example, the continuum of care would fill this form out on behalf of the survivor and send it over to the PHA. And as you can see, it's a very basic form, and the idea is to be as low barrier as possible, just to have essentially check boxes with very minimal questions about the survivor's experience. And this being used as the certification that somebody is a survivor of, say, domestic violence or human trafficking. You can download that form at EHV. It's not required, You know, so this is an optional form. And next slide. Just wanted to show an example of one that Los Angeles, California is using, that is, you know, another type of form that can be used. And Karlo, I don't know if you wanted to just pop up, because I know you've worked on this particular advocacy, if you just wanted to speak to kind of the features of this form as an example.
Sure. So let's see. It's funny. I just mentioned Los Angeles County in the chat box too in response to a question. So I'll kind of take both of those at the same time. But first about the form. So Renee mentioned on the previous slide that HUD does have a sample form. Honestly, it's okay. It's an okay form. It's a brand new form that they just put out. And I think it's actually in response to some of the comments that we've been sending to HUD headquarters. One of the things that survivor advocates like yourself have been asking for is to have a form that could provide a certification for all survivors, not just human trafficking, which was the initial form that HUD put out. And so that form is okay, but we thought that there was a question in there about where survivors have lived previously that we thought wasn't necessary. And so here is an example from the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, which is the agency that administers the continuum of care for Los Angeles County. So they went ahead and created their own form because they needed to move forward quickly with administering their EHVs. And so they came up with this form before actually HUD created a template for sort of all survivor advocates. So this is the form. I think that you can use this as a basis. As you can see, it asks for quite minimal information. It's basically, you know, some information about the name, the public housing agency that's involved, the victim service provider, and then you check a box, maybe several boxes about which definition the survivor falls under, and then you sign off on it. So again, the name of the game is to make sure that, you know, it's low barrier for survivors to access the vouchers as much as possible. And then in the chat box, there was a question about, you know, because of all the flexibility that the emergency vouchers are providing in terms of partnerships and collaborations, does that mean that housing authorities in different cities can work together? And the answer is yes. There's definitely that possibility. It's something that HUD is encouraging, is for there to be more partnerships that maybe historically have not happened. And so I provided the example of Los Angeles County, where the COC, the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, is actually coordinating all of the housing authorities in the county that received the emergency housing vouchers, received and accepted the vouchers. And so we see that county really, I've been a part of some of the meetings where all of the PHAs are on board and they're talking about different policies that they're trying to make sure are streamlined and are consistent. And something else we haven't, I don't think, quite touched on this yet, but for the vouchers, there's no residential requirement. So it's really different from the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, where for a lot of housing authorities, in order to get a Section 8 voucher, you have to live or work in their jurisdiction or in the area that that housing authority has authority over. But for these vouchers, you can get a voucher, apply for a voucher anywhere, and it's perfectly fine. So just keep that in mind too.
Thanks, Karlo. Next slide, please. And the link is there for this sample document, which I definitely recommend as well as you're thinking about advocating for particular forms or documentation that the COC is sending over to the housing authority. So what's different, you know, about the EHVs, and this is something that I briefly touched on earlier, which is this $3,500 services fee per voucher. And this is really intended to set up voucher families to be able to succeed. And, you know, one of the attendees mentioned a lot of the barriers that even when somebody, you know, waits on, you know, the regular housing choice voucher wait list, and they finally get a voucher, all of the other barriers that are in their way in terms of being able to lease up, on the private market. So there are some things that hopefully will be able to be used to again, provide some additional incentives for landlords, and to at least address some of the concerns that housing providers have expressed and in not wanting to rent to voucher holders. So first thing, housing search assistance is required. So, meaning that the survivor or other EHV household is going to have at least some help in trying to locate a unit to lease up with. And one of the things that victim service providers might want to advocate for is to try and contract with housing authorities to help do this, right? Particularly for survivor clients, so that there is somebody working with survivors to be able to find a unit that again is safe for them, and within their view of being safe. Because one thing that we've seen over the years with the regular housing choice voucher program, or this often actually comes up more in the emergency transfer context, is that housing providers have a different view of what is a safe unit for survivors and the survivors themselves. So again, having that specific survivor-centric housing search assistance would be really helpful, and that might be an avenue that folks on the line might want to try and broach with their housing authority to see if there can be something formalized where for survivors that housing search assistance is supported with some of this $3,500 services fee. Also, things like security deposits, right? Rental arrears, which is something that a lot of times survivors, really struggle with getting a security deposit because of economic abuse or financial coercion. So, none of these, except for the housing search assistance, is required. These are all sort of eligible uses. And so one thing is to really think about what you see as what your clients need in terms of successfully lease up, and really urge your housing authority to use that $3,500 per voucher to support, whether it is, security deposits if you live in a higher cost area, or if it really is landlord recruitment and incentives. Even retention payments are something that fall within an eligible use category, such that there's some sort of incentive provided once a housing provider renews a voucher tenant for a subsequent lease term, etc. Other eligible uses, moving expenses, that's something that is oftentimes a barrier for survivors. Essential household items, so that can be furniture. Renters insurance is oftentimes a big barrier, not just for survivors, but renters more generally. And tenant readiness services, so that means, addressing some of those, issues on a renter's record, in terms of kind of equipping the individual to be able to, kind of work with housing providers to explain, but also how to, just how to be a tenant that is successful in their tenancy. So there are other types of uses that that $3,500 can be used for. And so just really urge folks who are working with housing authorities on their EHV rollout to not forget the $3,500. And because housing authorities have flexibility in terms of how they use it, a point of advocacy could be to really use those resources to serve the specific needs of their survivor populations. Next slide, please. So Karlo, did you want to take it from here, or did you want me to cover this? I'm open.
Take it.
Okay.
Thanks, Renee.
Sure.
Yes. Hi, I'm Karlo Ng. I'm Director of Legal Initiatives at the National Alliance for Safe Housing. We will continue. Thank you so much for everyone for putting in all those questions. It's really nice to see folks engaged and raising really, really good questions actually in the chat. So keep them coming and we'll be sure to answer them throughout the presentation. So continuing on about what's different with these emergency vouchers. So as Renee mentioned, the vouchers are based on the Section 8 voucher program, but there's a lot that's different about these emergency vouchers, right? So another thing that is different is that what HUD has said is that the housing authorities that have these emergency vouchers, they have to keep a waiting list that is separate from the housing choice voucher waiting list. And that is a good thing, right? For those of us who know about the Section 8 program and how long people have to wait in order to get to the top of the waiting list, we're talking about easily in some places 6 to 7 years that folks are waiting just to get to the top of the waiting list. And so if these emergency vouchers were following the same waiting list patterns, then effectively it would take a very long time for the folks who are eligible for these vouchers to actually access them. So it's an entirely new waiting list that these emergency vouchers have, and that is to make sure that those folks who are eligible can more quickly access the vouchers. Like we mentioned before, the housing authorities cannot have any local residency preferences. So that again is very different from the Section 8 program, which allows housing authorities to require that there be some kind of residency or work preference where the person who is applying would have to work or reside in the housing authority's jurisdiction. But here HUD has said, no, we are really trying to make these vouchers as accessible as possible to anyone. Anyone who applies for these vouchers and are eligible should have access to them. So there is no requirement that the person who is applying and their household members have to live or work in the housing authority's jurisdiction. Renee also mentioned that there are some restrictions to bases that housing authorities can use to deny an individual or family from an emergency housing voucher. So Renee already mentioned that there are only 2 mandatory prohibitions based on criminal history. There's the methamphetamine one that Renee mentioned earlier, as well as the lifetime registration requirement for under state sex offender laws. So those are the 2 mandatory ones. There are also a bunch of prohibitions that are permissive for housing authorities to use. So these are entirely discretionary. These are the same permissive prohibitions that exist for the Section 8 program. But the difference in this situation with the emergency vouchers is that what HUD has said is that, hey, housing authority, if you want to use any of these permissive bases to not accept someone as part of the emergency voucher program, then you're also going to have to do an individualized assessment, meaning that you're going to have to look at each situation or application on a case-by-case basis and determine, does it really make sense to deny this individual or family an emergency voucher given the circumstances? So they would need to look into mitigating factors, if there are any issues or factors that they should take into consideration that would actually qualify them for the voucher. So there are a bunch of permissive bases of prohibition. So these include if a housing authority determines that a household member is currently engaged in or has engaged in within the last 12 months a violent criminal activity or other criminal activity that could threaten the health, safety, or right to peaceful enjoyment of the premises by other residents living in the immediate vicinity. If any household member has committed fraud, bribery, or any other corrupt or criminal act in connection with any federal housing program within the last 12 months, and if the family has engaged or threatened abusive or violent behavior toward a housing authority personnel within the last 12 months. So with me reading those bases, I think you could easily think of situations where survivors have been involved in violent criminal activity, or they may have been arrested because of the violence that was happening in the home, or maybe because of the violence, the housing provider saw them as engaging in some kind of abusive or violent behavior. So if you see your client sort of in a situation where they might be possibly denied the voucher because of these circumstances, again, the housing authority is required to do an individualized assessment that takes into account mitigating factors and any other circumstances that would permit the family to actually be eligible for the voucher. There are also some bases that are completely not allowed as bases to prohibit an individual or family from accessing these vouchers. And so we've listed them here. They're really, really important because in a Section 8 situation, these bases could easily be bases for which a family applying for a Section 8 voucher could be not eligible for a voucher. But in this emergency voucher program, these bases are not prohibited at all. So they include if the family has previously been evicted or terminated from federally assisted housing, that cannot be a reason why a family is not qualified. If the family owes rent or other amounts of money to a housing authority, so for example, for property damage, which frequently comes up for domestic violence survivors, that also is not permitted. If there's some kind of abuse of alcohol, if there's drug-related criminal activity, and if there's been some kind of prior breach of an agreement with the housing authority to pay money owed. So say the survivor and their family said that, okay, we'll pay you back this money owed, and this is our agreement, and didn't follow through for some reason. Those are all bases that are not allowed to prohibit a survivor or anyone accessing these emergency vouchers. Next slide, please. There's also a number of other things that are different about the emergency vouchers. I'll try to go through these fairly quickly. If folks have questions, please definitely raise them in the chat because we are going to be going through these fairly quickly. There are also a number of other things that are different about these vouchers as well. These are highlights that we are mentioning here, but you, I'm sure, learn about other ones as well if you go through the notice that HUD put out. So what is really different about these emergency vouchers as compared to the Section 8 program is that there's a lot of flexibility. Renee and I have been talking about flexibility, partnerships, thinking outside of the box, increasing access for people who qualify for these vouchers. And so flexibility is definitely a key word in this program. So there's a lot of flexibility for folks to produce documentation or verification that would normally be required upfront when folks are applying for the Section 8 program. So verification about income, for example, would normally be required upfront, but what HUD has said for the emergency vouchers is you can do a self-certification. And in fact, they say that self-certification for verifying income is the best verification that we can get. So you can, the applying family can go ahead and use that as the way to certify income. And for immigration status and social security number, normally for the Section 8 program, again, you'd have to provide that information up front in order to continue on with the process of being eligible for a Section 8 voucher and then receiving one. Here for the emergency voucher program, they have said, we will actually give you 180 days to produce your documentation to show that you're an eligible immigrant and also to show that at least one household member has a social security number in the household. So that is a lot of time. That is a lot more time than we've given out. It's about 6 months. And as HUD has also said that if the housing authority believes that the family has put forth a good faith effort in order to get verification about immigration status and social security number, and for whatever reasons that are outside of the control of the family, they cannot get that verification, the housing authority actually has discretion to extend that period of time beyond the 180 days to verify immigration. Housing authorities can also establish higher payment standards. And what that basically means is that for housing authorities that are in really hot housing markets, so we're in the Bay Area, Renee and I are in the Bay Area. This Bay Area is a really excellent example of a hot housing market where housing is extremely expensive. And so that means that rental costs are also very high. And what we've seen is that often the subsidies that HUD provides through different programs sometimes do not keep up with the rents and the rental market, and the amount of rent that's being asked for by landlords. And so what HUD has said is that if these housing authorities are in these hot housing markets, and they really believe that if they increased the amount of subsidies that they provided to the families through the emergency vouchers, that would increase, again, accessibility for the families, then they can go ahead and do that. Normally for the Section 8 program, if housing authorities wanted to increase subsidies for families trying to access the Section 8 vouchers, they would have to go through a long process where they'd have to petition to HUD headquarters, and then there'd have to be a back and forth that could easily take up to 6 months. And here, the housing authorities do not need HUD's approval, and they can go ahead and do that. And there's some restrictions around that, but it is still more flexible than the process that we have in place right now for the Section 8 vouchers. We've talked a little bit about leasing up, and related to that, search terms. The whole concept of leasing up is really important because even though a family may receive a voucher, and they go through a lot to get a voucher, right? They apply, they wait. Again, in some jurisdictions, that's easily 6 to 7 years. They get to the top of the wait list. There's additional verification and documentation and paperwork. And finally, they have the voucher. But that's not the end of the story, right? The family then needs to use this voucher and be able to use it in a unit that's in the private market. So that means that the landlord and owner of that unit needs to be willing to engage in the voucher program in order for the family to use the voucher and lease up for that unit. And so what we see a lot of the times is that, very sadly, families often lose their vouchers because they cannot find a landlord that will take the voucher and a unit that will take the voucher. And so right now in the Section 8 voucher program, the most number of days that you can get is at least 60 days for a family to lease up from the time that they receive a voucher. Now that period of time can be extended, and most of the time it is extended by the housing authority, because again, it is so difficult to lease up, and 60 days go by very, very quickly when you're trying to search for a unit in the market that will take the voucher. And so HUD has recognized that there is this huge barrier to lease up. And they said, okay, the initial search time is no longer the 60 days, it's 120 days. And that 120 days is also subject to an extension if the family is really trying to find a unit and is just not able to, because again, the housing situation in different jurisdictions is just so crazy. So that is really good news. There's also the initial lease term can also be less than 12 months. In the Section 8 program right now, housing authorities can require that if you are new to the program and you're new to living in the housing authority's jurisdiction, that they can require that the family lease up for a 12-month period. So they can say, you have to live in our jurisdiction with this voucher for at least 12 months. You cannot live here for a few months and then move with using the same voucher. HUD has said that, the folks who are eligible and we're trying to target for these emergency vouchers, they're going to have a bunch of different kinds of housing needs. So we take survivors, for example, survivors of gender-based violence. They have a myriad of different issues, and they may have different reasons why they need to move, for safety reasons or other reasons. So they might have to actually leave a month after they are in a unit, 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. And what HUD has said is that's okay. That's okay, that if they need to leave, they need to use that voucher somewhere else, they need to leave within the first 12-month period, that's okay, and they can retain the voucher assistance. They won't risk losing the voucher assistance if they try to use that voucher elsewhere within under a 12-month period. There's also no portability residency requirement. So that's related to the former point. So basically, anyone who gets these emergency vouchers can take their voucher and move it to another jurisdiction without a problem. So the Section 8 program right now has a lot of requirements about having a family reside in the area for at least a year before they can use that voucher in another jurisdiction. But for purposes of the emergency voucher, HUD has said there is no such portability requirement. So for example, if I get an emergency voucher at the Sacramento Housing Authority, which is in California, and I need to move to the Boston Housing Authority, to the Boston area, for safety reasons, I can do that even though I've only used my voucher for 2 months, because I need to move for safety reasons. I need a port. As long as the Boston Housing Authority will take my voucher, I can go ahead and do that with the emergency voucher. And then an important note is that emergency vouchers cannot be reissued to a new family after September 30th, 2023. What that means is that for a family that's been issued an emergency voucher before September 30th, 2023, they can go ahead and use the voucher like a normal Section 8 voucher for as long as they want. There was a question in the chat box about, is there a time restriction about how long someone can use these vouchers? And so far, HUD has told us that you can use these vouchers like a normal Section 8 voucher and there's no deadline. However, if a family has an emergency voucher, they got it before the September 30th, 2023 deadline, and for some reason they have decided to leave the program. Maybe they've decided we don't need this assistance anymore, we're doing fine, we can move on now. If they get out of the program after September 30th, 2023, that voucher does not go back in the pool. That voucher essentially disappears and it goes away. Now, if there are vouchers that the Housing Authority has that have not been issued, so these are brand new vouchers that have never been issued to any family, if they're brand new vouchers, then this requirement doesn't apply because they're brand new vouchers. They haven't been issued to any family. So even if the voucher exists after the 2023 deadline, that's fine. They can go ahead and be issued. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have some tips for you all advocates that are going to be working on the front lines with survivors and trying to help them access these emergency vouchers. So first of all, like we've said several times already, not all the housing authorities have these emergency vouchers. And in fact, I think it's actually a very small subset of the 3,300 housing authorities nationwide. So definitely look at the spreadsheet that we showed you earlier, but it's also available at that HUD website. Look at what housing authorities, and also look at the number of housing vouchers that they have, so that you can really target your advocacy. Like we've said, the survivors can apply for these vouchers from any housing authorities in any area. In North Carolina, you can also be outside of North Carolina if that helps you, but probably most people will be within North Carolina, but you can apply for for the vouchers in any housing authority. We're really encouraging survivor advocates to contact housing authorities as well as continuums of care to see if there are any updates on the emergency vouchers and how to apply. We're kind of in this sort of transition period right now where some continuums of care and housing authorities have memorandums of understanding in place already. So essentially they have contracts in place to work together. And so some of the COCs have actually already gone ahead and started administering the vouchers, and they have websites set up, they have information printed out, and they have phone lines set up to get people to apply. And the way that you're going to find out about these is by checking the websites and also by contacting the continuums of care and housing authorities directly. And remember, the continuums of care as well as other referral partners are going to be your first stop to help survivors apply for these vouchers, because their jobs are mainly to provide the referrals to the housing authorities. The housing authorities themselves are not taking applications from people who want these vouchers. They're going to refer you back to the continuums of care or the other referral partners that are part of the memorandums of understanding. So keep that in mind. That is really different from the Section 8 program, right? Where normally if you want a Section 8 voucher, you go to the housing authority, they give you paperwork, you fill it out, and you're on the waiting list. So here you have to go to the continuums of care and the referral partners. And what I've been seeing is that actually many continuums of care are not just doing sort of the threshold eligibility screening of saying, okay, you're a survivor, you fit in one of the 4 eligibility categories, great, I'll fill out this 1-page form, sign it, and give it to the housing authorities. A lot of COCs are actually doing the whole eligibility packet, which has been really helpful for housing authorities. So they're not just looking at the threshold eligibility, but they're also looking at, do you qualify based on immigration status, income requirements, and they're sort of checking all the boxes, getting all of the verification together if it's available, and then sending it as a package to the housing authority. So then again, this process is as streamlined and as efficient as possible. So that's kind of nice because COCs generally are equipped to sort of work with folks, as well as other referral partners are working with folks to help them apply for housing assistance. The deadlines are coming up quickly. The official deadline for COCs and PHAs to have these contract partnerships is July 31st. But like I said before, we're already seeing a lot of continuums of care and housing authorities executing their contracts already and definitely right now. So I would go ahead and check, on the websites and contact the North Carolina COCs and the housing authorities to get more information. Next slide, please. So this is an incredible opportunity for you all on the ground to work with housing authorities and continuums of care to establish relationships if you don't have them already, so that you can support survivors' housing needs. Now more than ever, because of the COVID relief assistance and all the encouragement that we're getting from the White House and the federal government to really have people who have not typically worked together, and agencies and organizations that have not typically worked together, to work together to make sure that the COVID relief and housing assistance is really getting to the people that really need the help. And so we're really encouraging you all to, send emails, make phone calls, even if you've never talked to these people before, and you need help with strategizing around how exactly to contact these folks, please reach out to Renee and myself. These are actually a lot of the questions that we're helping people answer is, I am a survivor advocate. I work for this agency. We've been around for a long time, but we just do not work with continuums of care. And we typically do not work with housing authorities. So where do we start? And what can we do? So here are some tips that we have here, that we've kind of been telling survivor advocates, and we put here for you to just sort of, so you have the information, if you can right now, and if it's not too late, because again, a lot of these memorandums of understanding have already been executed, but if it's not too late to really establish a partnership for direct referrals for emergency vouchers, where your organization and other victim service organizations can be part of the process of making the referrals to the housing authorities for these vouchers. And please don't forget the culturally specific organizations that are also providing victim services to survivors as well. Make sure that they're also integrated. HUD is recommending that organizations, that the referrals be integrated into coordinated entry, and see if that is a possibility. There are a lot of barriers to coordinated entry for those of us who have had direct experience with coordinated entry. There are just a lot of organizations and entities that are not integrated into coordinated entry for a number of different reasons. And so if that's not possible, definitely talk to the COC and see if that can be integrated. And if not, there's also a possibility to work outside of coordinated entry and to have referral relationships that are outside of coordinated entry. As an organization, you can also determine how the emergency vouchers are prioritized. So it's really, really important for COCs and housing authorities to know that survivors need access to housing assistance. I don't think that we can assume that COCs know that survivors need housing assistance. And so it's really going to take, your expertise and other localized expertise to really emphasize how and why survivors need these vouchers, and how exactly within the local prioritization survivors should fall compared to all the other housing needs, right? Like folks who are facing homelessness, folks who are homeless, or folks who may potentially be homeless, they are also all vying for the same vouchers. So how do you exactly prioritize? And that answer to that question is really going to vary locality by locality. Collaborating on supporting voucher holders. One of the biggest challenges for survivors is not only accessing housing assistance, but once they actually have housing assistance, to help them maintain that assistance. Because again, folks who are in crises, they are experiencing a lot of trauma all the time, and that can easily affect their ability to maintain their housing assistance. And so it's really important for local organizations like yours to be a part of the support system that a survivor has, to make sure that if they do need help, with whatever it is that they need in terms of support, that it's there. And that as part of that support, they are also getting assistance to make sure that they can maintain their voucher assistance no matter what happens. And so it's really important to have a partnership where the COC is working with agencies like yours to make sure that survivors are supported throughout this process, through even after they get the voucher. So a reminder that vouchers, these emergency vouchers, in addition to new admissions for new families, they can also be used for emergency transfers for survivors. Renee mentioned it earlier, but it's really important to sort of remind COCs and housing authorities that this is another uh, option for vouchers to be used. It's something that HUD has not really talked about in detail. So it's going to be really important to remind folks that, hey, survivors that are already in, say, public housing can also use these as a means to do an emergency transfer. Next slide, please. We've talked about this before, but ensuring that the voucher program is low barrier. It's really, really important to make sure that these vouchers are as low barrier as possible. And we keep on saying it because a lot of times for these federal housing programs, they're not. A lot of survivors and other folks typically get screened out for a variety of reasons, whether it's criminal histories, drug use, et cetera, et cetera. They get screened out quite easily, actually. And so we have to make sure that as advocates that the COCs and PHAs are ensuring that the program is low barrier and that it respects the confidentiality of survivors. Confidentiality is extremely important. There's going to be a lot of information that's going to be shared, and there are different entities involved. It's not just the PHA and the survivor now. It's also involving COCs and likely other referral partners. And to make sure that that confidentiality still exists is going to be critical throughout this process. And also identifying any other service and system gaps that you see. And to create partnerships to assist the voucher holder. So anything else, any other sort of system gaps that you have probably historically or typically seen is likely going to exist for this program, right? It's not like this program has suddenly resolved all the issues that we see that really force survivors sort of fall through the gap. So being mindful of that and also trying to address that head on with the COCs and the referral partners is also going to be critical. And if you want more information about how to find your local COC and housing authorities, the information is on the HUD website. We included a sample letter. The link for it is on the next slide. But this is a sample letter from the New York City Continuum of Care domestic violence co-chairs to the same COC steering committee co-chairs. It's a letter that I included because I think the way that they went about doing the advocacy and really arguing for prioritization for survivors, I thought was really tactfully done well. So go ahead and check that out. And what you'll see is that the advocates basically outline the survivors' need for permanent affordable housing locally. And they advocated for prioritization of the vouchers for survivors using the ability for the housing authorities to establish local preferences. And what was really interesting is they used data showing that survivors are overrepresented in the homelessness system. So there are lots of survivors that are in shelters. But when you look at the data for permanent affordable housing, it's actually a very small percentage. So it's double digits in the homelessness shelter. And then when it comes to permanent affordable housing, it's single digits. So if you locally are seeing some of those similar data, that's really, really helpful for making the case of why survivors should be prioritized in getting these vouchers. The letter also talks about integrating into the continuum of care's coordinated entry system and some of the challenges that they've seen in terms of getting survivors to really be integrated into that system. And then they also encourage that if survivors cannot be integrated into the coordinated entry system, that there are other entities that can also enter into an MOU with the PHA to do separate referrals. Okay, let's see. If you're experiencing any challenges with housing authorities or COCs, what HUD has said is that you can actually email them at that email address, the ehv@hud.gov. If you're not totally comfortable doing that yet, you can also just go ahead and contact Renee or myself first if you want to just sort of brainstorm around strategy. And then the next slide is our resources. I think everything is pretty self-explanatory. We do have an EHV guidance that we wrote along with the Minnesota DV Coalition and the National Network to End Domestic Violence. It basically provides a lot of the tips that we've already talked about and provides more detail around it. There's a link to the Los Angeles's certification form for survivors, and then the letter from New York City. And the last slide is just our contact information. So we're happy to take any questions that folks have for the remaining time period.
Hey, Karlo, I just wanted to, lift up something that Kenyatta from the audience had pasted in the chat about, EHVs and, for folks who already are living in housing and the extent to which, those resources can be used. And one point that, there is this category of at risk of homelessness. But I just wanted to take a sec and just, just also flag for folks that, because EHVs aren't necessarily going to be available in every PHA, one other place to look would be your local emergency rental assistance program. If somebody is behind on rent, and that might be another means by which they can stay in their housing, particularly if they feel like they're safe in their current housing situation. Rental assistance, is another means, and it's more broadly available. It also has its challenges in terms of application and access. But I just also wanted to flag that as another resource for folks who are trying to stay housed. I don't know, Karlo, if you had any other thoughts about that. I just wanted to flag that.
No, I think that's right. It's really, really challenging. It's interesting. I mean, there are no prohibitions about the vouchers being used for people who are currently housed, which I think that's the question. I couldn't quite find it.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I realized I was only chatting to attendees, so I had to post the response twice.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So basically, the extent to which people can use EHVs if they're already housed.
Okay. Yeah, you can, right? You can for sure. And, we've provided the example of folks who need an emergency transfer. So those folks are obviously housed, but they need a safety move, so they can use that. And, as long as these folks are meeting all of the eligibility requirements, I don't see why they wouldn't be able to, access the vouchers.
And sorry, I'll put myself back on camera. And then one other question we got was just somebody who has a voucher and they need to move to another jurisdiction for safety. And so one thing that I wanted to note for Veronica's question is, I don't think if the client already has a Section 8 voucher, my suggestion would be actually to use the portability feature of the current voucher that they have. And so basically ask your housing authority about starting the process to port to, the housing authority in the other state. Because having a Section 8 voucher also means that, you are able to live anywhere, right? There's just a process that somebody has to go through in order to basically transfer the voucher to another housing authority. So I would try to find out with the housing authority what they're, how they can initiate what's called portability or a port. And then, that way the survivor wouldn't necessarily have to go through, the emergency housing voucher process, since they, already have a voucher or about to be issued a voucher. Basically, you would use that to port right away. Also, the other thing I think that's really important, if the client is a survivor of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, and they need to move for safety, a lot of housing authorities, as Karlo mentioned, have restrictions on when you're able to move, with your voucher. But those restrictions don't apply in situations where somebody is a survivor and they need to move for safety. So you might also need to tell the housing authority that this is a survivor safety related move, and they might ask, for some VAWA related documentation. But that would be the response for that particular situation. If somebody is fortunate to already have a voucher, I would say I'd probably just try to port that voucher as opposed to restarting the process to get an EHV. Great question though.
And I see there's always some really great questions about immigration status, which is why actually, for folks who work with a lot of mixed status families and just immigrant folks generally, if you're really hoping that these vouchers can reach those folks, I'm actually doing a follow-up webinar with Freedom Network. So Freedom Network is an organization that has a membership of anti-trafficking organizations, but I was able to work with them, and we're going to do a webinar on July 29th. I can share the information about that with the facilitators here to make sure that you have that information. But that webinar is going to focus specifically on immigration status requirements and the emergency housing voucher program, just because there have been so many nuanced questions about who qualifies and what situations, and what about this, and what about like DACA folks, other folks with different kinds of immigration status, and what are the documentation requirements. So we're really going to hone in on like the nitty gritty, right? So if you are curious about that, please tune in. That's July 29th. And I'll send you all the information. And just a note about that is, this program, the voucher program, is also eligible to families where only the children are survivors. So that can happen in a sexual assault situation where the children, the minors, are sexual assault survivors, but the adults in the household are not survivors. So there have been some questions about, well, what if you have that scenario? Is the family still eligible for these vouchers? The answer is yes. The answer is yes, and the same eligibility requirements apply, the immigration requirements apply. Anyone in the household needs to be a US citizen or eligible immigrant in order for the family to qualify. And if it's mixed status, then the assistance is prorated.
I don't see any other questions, but let me check. Yeah, and I would highly recommend Karlo's webinar. Karlo is always just such a wealth of information.
Oh my goodness.
No. Yeah, and since we have a couple minutes, just one thing, since I mentioned emergency rental assistance, just while we're talking about immigration, just one important point that we've seen is that states have been imposing, and this is separate from the emergency housing voucher program, but we've seen states and localities impose immigration requirements with respect to rental assistance. So this is the emergency rental assistance, for folks who are behind on their rent. And just note that there is no actual requirement, or those immigration restrictions shouldn't be happening. There's nothing requiring or limiting access to that rental assistance on the basis of immigration status. So since we have a couple of extra minutes, and Karlo, I know you've also worked on this issue, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought when you mentioned that you were actually going to just talk about the other emergency rental assistance available. But I don't know, Renee, if you happen to just have a link that you want to put in the chat box. So there is this whole other pot of money that is COVID relief related. And instead of HUD, Treasury is actually administering the program. It's called the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, but it's $46 billion. It's $46 billion total, and Treasury is doling out the money to states and localities so that they can give the money to folks locally who need the money. There's a whole bunch of requirements and criteria, but Renee will put the information there. We've done several webinars about this as well. So if folks want more information, we can provide the link to the recording of one of the webinars we've done recently.
Yeah, and I've put in the chat, I have put in a link that our friends at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition have done a really good job of tracking local rental assistance programs. And so, as Karlo said, kind of separate from what we've been talking about today, if you have other clients who are, housing insecure or want to stay in their housing and behind on rent, which, has affected a lot of folks, with the upcoming end of the CDC eviction moratorium at the end of this month, that's also just an important point as well. And so definitely just check that out if you haven't already, to see state and local programs that might be in place.
So I think that's it.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here. And like we said at the beginning, pulling things together so quickly for us. And I had already seen this webinar, which is why I wanted to have y'all do it for our programs here. So it's great. I think it's full of really helpful information. I learned a lot from it. So thank you so much. And like we said at the beginning, the webinar today was recorded. So we'll upload that as soon as we can. And we'll also share the slides. And I'll share the information from Karlo as well about the upcoming webinar. Cassie, do you want to say anything?
Yes, thank you so much, Karlo and Renee. This was incredibly helpful.
It's our pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
Awesome.
Bye,
If
everyone.
anyone has any questions, feel free to email them, or you can email me or Cassandra, and I'll put my email in the chat real quick.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.